Good afternoon and welcome. I'm Stephen Orper. I'm the Senior Director for Policy here, and it's wonderful to see so many of our familiar faces among our policy and corporate supporters, as well as a number of new visitors today. So we have a packed house for an extraordinary discussion that will cap off the year and will lean forward with some positive outlook on kickstarting negotiations. While we'll go through some of the complexity with Eminent scholar David Kang and with Ambassador Thomas Hubbard, we look forward to ending the year and picking up on the note that was left by President Moon Jae-in when he addressed the Korea Society Council on Foreign Relations and Asia Society earlier in the fall. Those of you who were with us on December 6th heard a rather sobering assessment from some friends of ours with the Brookings Institution and CSIS, and this is designed to extend that discussion and also provide some positive bent and look at opportunities for forward movement. Again, we would like to welcome all of you. We would especially like to welcome Nick Bratt, Phil Sherman, our board members, and the Deputy Consul General and his entire team of 15 from the Republic of Korea Consulate. They have had the very hard job in 2018 of convincing a lot of people, and it's been an extraordinary effort, and we here at the Korea Society are very admiring of all that they do in town to put out the good word on Korea. As an American independent nonprofit organization, we certainly benefit from partnerships and a lot of time shared in discussion to better understand where the Republic of Korea is going. To help us understand the complexity of the situation today, we do have David Kang, who is an eminent professor. He is the author of several books, including most recently this year, the re-release of Nuclear North Korea, a book that he wrote with Victor Cha, who's often on our stage. And that is as important now in 2018 as it was on its initial release in 2003. That's out through Columbia University Press, and we highly recommend it. David also is the director of the Korean Studies program out of USC, and they do a tremendous amount and really are one of the highlights in terms of Korean studies on the west coast of the United States. Of course, we have Ambassador Thomas Hubbard, familiar to many of you as the chairman of the Korea Society, senior director for Asia at McLarty Associates, longtime and distinguished career diplomat who served as our ambassador in both the Philippines and the Republic of Korea. And moderating our discussion today is our president, Thomas Byrne. Tom served with Moody's and has been president here since August of 2015. And we've introduced a number of new programs. Those of you who follow our policy, economics, and finance discussions know that we've had a heady steam, and that's really largely the result of Tom's guidance and leadership. So he will facilitate the discussion today. We thank you again. A very Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, and Happy New Year. Tom, over to you.
Okay, thanks, Stephen. Right, so we're all here to take another assessment of where we stand with the extraordinary developments of this past year, South Korea's engagement with North Korea and also the U.S.'s engagement with North Korea. This is really in follow-up to the speech that President Moon Jae-in made when he was here for the UN General Assembly in September. He made that as Stephen Norper said, at the Council on Foreign Relations, and this was an event that the Korea Society as well as the Asia Society, I see Danny Russell is here, co-hosted along with the Council on Foreign Relations. I'd like to repeat some of the points that President Moon made. Maybe this could prompt some reaction and discussion from you, David, and also from Tom Hubbard. So President Moon started off by noting, as we all recognize, that it was really a remarkable turn of events when Kim Jong-un gave his New Year's speech a year ago, because stepping back, if this were 2017, I think none of us could have imagined what would unfold this year. But President Moon went even further than calling it remarkable. He called it a miraculous development that's happening on the Korean Peninsula. And what he was referring to is that the establishment of a permanent peace regime on the Korean Peninsula through the complete denuclearization of North Korea. Now, he also said that he hoped that once a complete and verified denuclearization has taken place, then North Korea could focus on economic development, and that would mean north-south, some sort of economic program set up, maybe funding set up, but all this is preconditioned on denuclearization and verifiable denuclearization from North Korea. And he also said that for this denuclearization to take place, for North Korea to actually go ahead with this, and that the U.S. has to end the hostile state of relationship between North and South Korea has to end. He talked about security guarantees. He also talked about, President Moon also talked about the necessity for some sort of end of war declaration, a political declaration. At the same time, he stressed that all these remarkable changes that had taken place through September were achieved based on what he called the rock solid ROK-US alliance. And he went on to say, furthermore, that even after a peace treaty is signed, and even after reunification, the ROK-US alliance should remain in place in order to continue to uphold peace and stability in the Northeast Asian region. So with that as a primer, David, why don't you try to work that in, or just go ahead with your prepared statements,
well,
mentally prepared
I'll take
statements.
a minute or two and just give an overview, right? Is that, I think that's fine. I also think it's funny that there was a reference to the Brookings CSIS thing. It was a little more skeptical. I was just in D.C. for a week of meetings with various officials across, and think tank. And as you probably know, the mood in the Beltway is extremely skeptical. Everybody's and they think that Moon is eager and perhaps too eager to change things. And one of the reasons that I'm on the West Coast and not in the Beltway is because I have a totally different perspective, right? I think this is the real question is this: is this the chance, a totally unprecedented opportunity where we can do something? Or is this just same old, and we know they're lying and they're trying to get something from us, et cetera, et cetera? The conventional wisdom is very much there's nothing really new here. It's just another ploy. It's another way in which they're trying to set up the United States or get away with something. But I tend to think that this is actually, in many ways, a historic opportunity that we'll get once in a generation. I think there was one in sort of the mid-'90s that we managed to fumble away. Everybody did. We have a new leader in South Korea. We have a leader in North Korea. And we have a president in the United States, all three of whom are willing to do things that none of their previous leaders have been able to even conceive of or consider. And does that mean we'll get there? I'm not sure whether we will or not. But this is an opportunity to take a step back from where we were. And I think all of us would prefer to be where we are this year in December as opposed to where we were last year in December. So in many ways, the question is, do we have a strategy for going forward? And I'll say I'm happy to expand on this if you want. I think Kim Jong-un has a very clear strategy, and he knows what he's doing. I'm happy to explain that. This is not something where he sort of woke up last January and said, okay, let's go to the Olympics. Who wants to go, right? I need a skier. 2 skiers. Who skis, right? They clearly knew what they were going to do. It was clearly long planned. Moon Jae-in has clearly spent 10 years thinking about what he would have done differently or what he would do differently if he were president. I think the real question is, does the United States have a strategy? I think some in our administration do. As we all know, it's not clear whether President Trump shares the way that many of the policymaking establishment wants to go. We found that just yesterday with Syria, right? I think the real question is, does the United States have a strategy for actually moving forward and taking this ball wherever it is today and moving it down the path a little bit farther? And I think we'll find out. But I think that's really the question is, how are we going to move forward? Because I think both sides of the Korean Peninsula are ready to try and move. And I think the question is, can the U.S. meet them in some manner?
Mm-hmm. Right. Tom, so is this an historic opportunity, an opportunity for a breakthrough perhaps, or the same old game?
Well, first, let me say that, David, we're very glad to have you here on the East Coast.
I should have said thank you for having me.
Yeah, we're glad to have you here on the East Coast because I think we do here on the East Coast need some bucking up. That the mood certainly has been very, very skeptical. And I'm glad to hear you because I'm inclined to agree that we have an opportunity now that we have not had in the past. With three unusual leaders, in Kim Jong-un, I think we have a continuation of the North Korean dictatorship, but we do seem to have in Kim Jong-un a leader who cares about the people. He does seem to be trying to do something that will uplift the Korean people, but I do think he still wants to have his nuclear weapons too. And the question is, can he be persuaded to give up those weapons in the interest of the betterment of his people? I think in Moon Jae-in we have a very different person too, someone who, as you say, has been thinking about this for a long time, has a strategy, had the courage to pick up on the initial moves that Kim Jong-un made to try to turn it into something, and finally we have President Trump in the midst of all of the skepticism, willing and kind of eager to take a chance and wanting to keep this going. So I think we probably have a better chance now than we have had in the past, but I think the chances of moving forward into the denuclearization of North Korea are still very slim, and it is certainly a long-term prospect. I think we were reminded today that Kim Jong-un isn't really lying. He's willing to have denuclearization of the Korean Peninsula and the entire area, and part of that in his mind, as we saw in a statement put out by the government press this morning, that he does see, when he says denuclearization, he means full denuclearization, elimination of any U.S. nuclear threat to him on the Korean Peninsula or in the region, and that obviously is a step that is going to be very hard to do. And so I'm a little less optimistic this morning after reading that, now that he's been very explicit in what he means by this until now undefined denuclearization, and I'm really not sure where we pick up and go from here. But I do have the sense, despite all the skepticism in Washington, that at least until this morning, people were planning on another Trump-Kim Jong-un meeting in the early months of next year. It is also disappointing that Kim Jong-un hasn't managed to get to Seoul as he had promised to do this year. But again, I think we'll have another round of feeling each other out, and I do think we have a better chance now than we have in the past. And as you said, we certainly have to feel a lot better this December than we did last December, whereas we're now talking about talks, how we get back to talks instead of talking about the threat of war. The good news is that in more than a year there has been no North Korean testing of nuclear weapons or ballistic missiles. My question is how long can this last if we don't get back into some kind of process? And one of the disappointing things is up until now, the North Koreans have really been willing only to talk at the very top level, and it's going to be hard to get to productive discussions with that attitude.
Right. Yeah, so when I woke up, I read the same news that the North Korean Central News Agency said that defined what they meant by denuclearization, mean elimination of the threat from the U.S. and probably the nuclear umbrella in the alliance with the U.S., maybe with Japan too. But I wonder, is this really news? I mean, shouldn't this have been discussed at the Pompeo's visit or Moon's visit? I mean, is this really news? It's news to us, but is it news to the U.S. government and the South Korean government? Didn't they know when they entered into this process of engaging North Korea summit talks that this is North Korea's starting position? Is that a surprise, David? Yeah.
No, it's not a surprise. I don't think there's anything new in this stuff, right? Like, oh, one of the so our book, which makes a great Christmas gift, by the way, Mom will love it. We wrote literally 15 years ago, and the same issues are on the table then as they are today. So I don't think it's really a surprise. North Korea has always said this would not be a unilateral disarmament. What that means is, sort of maybe more specific today than it was yesterday, but nobody thought that North Korea, it was unrealistic to think that North Korea would simply, let a boat back up into Wonsan Harbor and they would just load up all the nukes and then say, okay, we're done with it, right? I mean, this is always going to be a mutual process. And the question from the American side was always, what will we do in response? What is going to be on the table from our side, which this administration has not made clear yet, what is on the table and what's not. And they might have done it again privately or something else, but certainly publicly, it's not clear. And the North Koreans have consistently said this will not be a one-way process. So what they said today isn't that surprising. The other small thing I'll say is, it points out how unrealistic either of these goals is. We all know there is no possible way to verifiably, whatever it's called now, FFVD, fully, finally, completely verifiably denuclearize North Korea. They could let inspectors into every bedroom and look under every bed and in every closet, and we'll still think he's got some hidden. And they could always start over, right? It will never be perfect, complete and irreversibly. They can always start over. Mm-hmm. And the same thing for the United States. There's no way that we can promise not to ever threaten North Korea, because of course we can. We're in the United States, right? A massive military. Of course we can always change our minds. So the question is, how do we get beyond the unrealistic to something that moves us from here and moves us in the right direction? And I think that's a much more realistic goal, is to move back a little bit as opposed to say, here's the end goal, and if we don't get there right away, I'm walking away.
Then what would be those steps?
I think we're seeing some of those steps right now, right? I mean, like some of the first steps, and again, one of the interesting things is like a year without missile and nuclear tests. That's huge. Why did we care? The missile and nuclear tests. I mean, I suspect, I'll make a prediction, if North Korea doesn't test anymore, I think the air for any kind of real pressure goes out of the balloon. I mean, I really think that's the provocations that we care about. And if they just sort of stop right now and stand still, it'll be very hard to get a lot of enthusiasm or momentum forward for any more coercive steps on the American side, right? So there's things they could do. They could do a little bit. They're already doing stuff for the conventional. And if you think about it, when was the most of the killing that went on in the last 50 years? It's conventional. It's Northern Limit Line. I mean, that's huge. Yeah. That stuff is, boats out there shooting each other up and 20 people died. That's massive. To actually make some progress on the Northern Limit Line in the maritime or the DMZ. Which are steps back.
Right. But President Moon in his speech mentioned that it's significant that there has been no testing of either missiles or nuclear weapons, and that shows that some progress has been made. But couldn't you look at it from the other side? It's making a virtue out of necessity, because whenever North Korea did test, it faced ever-tightening sanctions. And there's one thing I think we do know, is that North Korea doesn't like the sanctions. Okay, I mean, trade with China, visible trade has collapsed in 2018. There must be some economic pressure being felt in North Korea, right?
Yeah.
I don't know, virtue out of necessity, or is this really a significant step? Tom, what do you think about that?
I think it's significant. I mean, that is the biggest problem, the biggest concern. Sure, they have, the North Koreans said in stopping their testing that they didn't need to test anymore. They already had their deterrent. I don't think that's quite true. They do need to test to improve their capability. But I think it's symbolically very important that they stop. And indeed, I think you sort of pointed to a dilemma that in fact I think the North Koreans will soon realize that so long as they're not testing, they're not getting our attention. And going back, in fact, one of their statements, I think even that statement this morning talked about the U.S. seemingly falling back into the Obama policy of strategic patience. At some point, they're going to knock on our door again. And I do think also that while we all knew what we thought we knew what the North Koreans meant by denuclearization, I'm not sure President Trump did, and certainly his public posture didn't suggest that in any way. So that now that the emperor has publicly declared that he has no clothes, we have to see where we go. I think it does complicate the circumstance.
Right. President Moon aspired to have a declaration to the end of the Korean War by the end of this year. Do you think we'll get it? And if we do, what are the implications, or are there any unintended bad consequences from something like this? That would it affect the alliance, or what's Tom? Why don't you start?
Yeah, I mean, obviously it's not going to happen this year.
We still have 10 days.
Yeah, exactly, and frankly, it's something I think we ought to seriously think about. But the North Koreans have, over the course of the year, sort of rearrange their priorities. Originally, I think when President Moon was here, everybody thought, well, the first thing to do is declare the end of the war. And North Koreans at some point said, no, that's not really important. What we really want is to get rid of the sanctions. And that came out in today's statement too. So I think that particular issue has become a lesser priority as the year has gone on. Mm-hmm. But it is something that President Moon would like to have. I think this has been a blow to him, not getting the meeting in Seoul and not getting a declaration of the end of the war.
Mm-hmm. How important is a declaration to the end of the war?
I mean, we tend to view this stuff in two ways that tend to be a little contradictory, or just different ways. One is it's all symbolic, so it's meaningless. On the other hand, you can't do that. Well, if it's meaningless, then why? Who cares, right? You're giving them a victory. Well, I tend to think that the symbolism really matters, right? And I don't think it's the end all. Almost none. I mean, first of all, the thing to remember about almost all of this is negotiating. This is what countries do. This is what people do. Right? Setting out some lines. Maybe you mean it. Maybe you don't. I mean, that's why you engage in diplomacy in the first place, is to find out what they really care about, what they don't. I think the symbolism of trying to end the hostility between the two sides of the Korean on the Korean Peninsula is enormous. You can always build the guard posts. You can always, I mean, the images shown here of the two militaries shaking hands is incredible, right? That's very powerful. Mm-hmm. And I think that can really matter in terms of setting a tone by which you can try and have both sides try and take other steps. So I think that symbolism can really matter. At the same time, it's not going to, you can always remine and rebuild add more mines and et cetera, et cetera. So I think these are part of a larger package of trying to figure out, because here's the other thing, the nuclear weapons won't matter if we're not worried about the other country, if we're not worried about North Korea, right? We tend to put nukes first, but it's an entire relationship. And we tend to think we get rid of the nukes, then we'll worry about the rest of the relationship. In some ways, if you fix the rest of the relationship, then the nuclear weapons don't matter. There's a lot of countries that have nuclear weapons that we're not particularly worried about. Frankly, even China, for all of the headbutting that we're doing with China, we're not worried about a nuclear exchange with China because we know it's not going to happen. So, I mean, there's ways in which you can work on all of these different things without necessarily having to prioritize them.
Right. But I understood there's one thing different with North Korea. There's the risk of proliferation of the nuclear weapons that I think we're more concerned with North Korea than we are with, say, China, right?
Sure.
Yeah.
Right.
But that would add urgency to getting denuclearization, right?
It would be nice to have. Go ahead.
No, I do think the proliferation issue is an important one, and it's particularly important in Northeast Asia because it is such a center of nuclear activity and sort of potential hostility. So certainly the implications for Japan, for South Korea are very, very strong if North Korea continues and permanently becomes a nuclear power. But then you get to the question of how do you stop that? How do you get there? And my own view on it is that with North Korea, we absolutely have to retain denuclearization as our goal. We have to keep trying to get there, even though it will take a very long time and a lot of negotiations to achieve it.
Right. David, you talked about Kim Jong-un has a strategy, that he actually is a rational leader, maybe one of the most rational leaders that we have, looking what's going on in the world. But President Moon's strategy, I understand, for engagement is first establish a peace regime, then develop a prosperous Korean peninsula, or at least raise the standard of living of North Korea. And then at some remote stage, you get reunification, but not by absorption by South Korea, by a merger of sorts, a confederation and whatnot. Does Kim Jong-un share the same vision, or is his strategy more political than economic? Or, I mean, what's his long-term vision for the Korean Peninsula? What do you think it is?
I mean, my take on Kim Jong-un is it's clearly he's concerned about his survival, regime survival. So it's fundamentally a political strategy. And one of the reasons that I think it's different is he's a different leader in a different place than either his father or his grandfather. It's just the way the world works. He has a 40-year, whatever, assuming he lives that long, right? He'll rule till he's 70. He needs a strategy for 40 years. It's a different type of calculus that he has to make than if it's very short term. I mean, this is why I say I think he's got a strategy. This is not something where he's just worried about tomorrow. And if you think about it, what is the strategy that's going to allow him to survive? And this is why I think it's actually a very clear strategy, is if you go to 2017, January 1, his New Year's Day speech, this is the year that we are going to achieve our long desired goal. And you know what? All year they did. 60 tests, bam, 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 nuclear tests, long, short range, all the way into November, into December, right? Things we never thought they would do. They don't test in the winter. Oh, they did. We went berserk. Tests, sanctions, threats, indirect offers to talk, et cetera, right? January 1, 2018, we've achieved our desired goal. Let's talk. Right? Again, I don't think it was like December 29 that he woke up and said, let's do this. Clearly, they decided some back 2016, and I actually think there's a lot of other evidence that it's longer than that. And they probably said this as they're sitting around in their council of deliberations or whatever else, right? We've done a slow motion nuclearization for 20 years. Stop us before it happens. And they take a little step here, a little step there, and they haven't done it, right? So in 2015 or so, they say, instead of doing, and we've gotten nowhere. We're still in the same place. From their perspective, again, right? The Americans aren't meeting us, et cetera, et cetera. Instead of saying, stop us before we do it, let's march up the hill and see what they do. And then we can always march back down the hill. But if not, we can stop here, which is exactly what they did. Now they've got it, right? Again, it's not as good as they'd like, but they have a deliverable nuclear weapon. And they're at the top of the hill. And they say, okay, we'll be willing to walk back down the hill if you want. But it's a different strategy. And I can see why you would end up with that strategy. And the question they clearly asked themselves was, Americans are going to go berserk. Can we deal with the sanctions? And they clearly said yes. And here's our off-ramp. This is what we're going to do. Right? This is not at all clear when you're back in 2015 whether that's a better strategy than what they were currently doing. And so I think I can see a very clear strategy that has economic component and a military component, but it's about long-term regime survival.
Do you think Kim Jong-un was surprised by the ratcheting up of sanctions in 2016 by the UN and also by the U.S.?
I don't. A lot of people think he was surprised. I don't see how you could be surprised by that. They've already been sanctioned an extraordinary number of times, right? The idea that, well, this time they won't get worse. If we do stuff much worse, and they would say the Americans aren't going to ratchet up and make it worse, that to me, that's not realistic. They knew if they said, if it was a conscious strategy, we are going to test and we're going to do all this stuff and it's going to be paced out this way and we're going to nuclear test, ICBM tests, et cetera. Of course the Americans are going to go berserk. you have to say, well, probably they're going to respond.
But were they surprised that China signed on to all the sanctions in the UN?
I don't think so.
You don't think so, right?
And there's a lot of indication right now that China, superficially sort of went along, and now all the shelves are all full of stuff again on the border regions and everything, right? Like, we'll find out, but I think they have a strategy. So can we deal with it? And the answer is probably yes.
Right.
Not that it would be great, but could they deal with it?
Right.
Could I ask David a question here, a follow-up? Because, everything you outline is a strategy vis-a-vis the United States, and that could have been planned. Although, of course, they had no idea they were going to get the gift of Trump, which I think it was a gift.
I don't think anybody expected that. Yeah.
But they also could not expect the gift of Moon, that Park Geun-hye would have fallen the way she did, and he came on. So they've had to deal with some variables along the way.
And that's why I think it's even more was a deliberate strategy, because they couldn't have said, well, we're going to get a progressive president in. I mean, that you couldn't have predicted, right? I mean, so they decided on this strategy, even knowing that there was probably a more hardline government in the South and a typical American president, right? I mean, and that's why I think everyone is, the thing that probably surprised everyone is how 3 leaders came together in this way. I mean, nobody could have predicted a Singapore summit.
Getting back to the strategy, though, it seems to me what you're saying, that the long-term objective of the strategy is just regime survival. Isn't it
fundamentally
more than that?
I mean, there's more than that, but I mean, that's the basic goal. But again, and I think what Kim Jong-un, the thing that we've always said, which is, again, it's been a little bit, there's 2 sides to this coin, is that the North Korea can never reform, because once they open up their economy, everyone will leave, et cetera, et cetera. But there's a lot of evidence that a lot of authoritarian dictatorships reform their economies and become fabulously wealthy, like China, without the regime falling. I mean, it's not at all clear. Cuba hasn't fallen yet. And like there's Vietnam, right? There's a lot of authoritarian governments. So, part of it is, well, they can never reform. On the other hand, if they don't change, they really are in trouble as they get poorer and poorer. And I think, again, there was a decision looking forward. It's never clear if that's the right decision. I mean, but you could make an argument for, we can reform our economy, make people better off, and we can still retain power.
I think it's the authoritarian governments can reform, but is North Korea authoritarian or totalitarian? I mean, China didn't reform, and it had a cult of personality under Mao. It had to make that big transition into a Deng Xiaoping-led government, not a cult of personality. But Tom, how do you see North Korea's long-term strategy? Can they achieve their regime survival without denuclearization and without economic development?
Well, I think Kim Jong-un's strategy is to try to do that. I think he continues to want to have his cake and eat it too, be able to continue to have his deterrent, and within that to develop. And I think that is the trick for all of us. I see a couple of other, Danny Russell, Bob Carlin's back there. We've been at this for 25 years, and for that entire 25 years, the premise has been that at some point the North Koreans can be persuaded that their own security, their survival, et cetera, depends on abandoning nuclear weapons, opening up, et cetera. And it hasn't happened in those 25 years. And I don't think they've accepted that point yet. And that's the real challenge ahead.
Okay. And will there be a second summit with President Trump and Kim Jong-un? And if there is, what can we expect from it? Perhaps more than the June summit?
My sense from everything I hear in Washington, and is that we are counting on a second summit, that the president wants it, that we're likely to find some way to have it, and I do hope and expect that summit in Korea, South Korea somewhere, will happen early in the year too. I think we'll have another round, but we've got a lot to work through.
So if we were a year ago, if we were sitting here on December 20th, I think we'd all be, and I asked you, where do you think we'll be a year from now? So we could imagine what our response would have been. But where do you think we'll be a year from now? Starting from today, December 20th, 2018.
Yeah, I mean, no one could have predicted a year ago that we'd be where we are today, right? So given that caveat,
is there a risk we'll be back to where we were?
I don't think it can get as bad. Simply as I said, I think in some okay. So here's some of the things that I think have changed no matter what. I think one of the first things that's changed, and this again, I think is Kim Jong-un's strategy. I think what he tried to do early on in his rule, like 2012, 2013, is he tried to show the world that he was a normal guy. He did things that no North Korean leader ever did. Like we saw his pretty wife, and he'd show his pictures, right? We never saw them before, right? Yeah. Oh, yeah, exactly, right? Or sister, etc., right? We saw his wife. We saw him going to basketball games, and I understand that he didn't want Rodman. He wanted someone else first, right? But Rodman was the only one, right? But he was trying to show, I'm a normal guy.
He wanted Michael Jordan.
Is that
Rodman said so?
Okay, right? Yeah, I mean, but the point was, I think he tried a lot of things that everything he did, we all laughed at and said, how strange. Yeah. But I think that was part of I'm a normal guy. I think the summits and the meetings, particularly for South Koreans, having him talking and seeing him on TV and hearing him speak, he's sort of relentlessly polite to Moon, who's like 20 years old. I mean, he's 30 years old or whatever. He's incredibly polite the way he speaks to him and stuff, right? It's hard. The one thing that's changed, it's harder to sustain the crazy man thesis. I think that's gone, right? I mean, too many people have seen it, so they may not like what he's doing, but the idea that this is just some crazy man, I think is gone, right? So we're in a different place we are today than we were, right? Could it go back as bad? It obviously could, but again, I think that as long as North Korea doesn't test, I think it'll be very hard to go back to where we were, no matter how long they drag their heels or drag it out.
So you would predict the status quo for another year, or will we make some sort of?
I think here's the other thing. I think Moon has a strategy, and I think Moon has a bunch of other smaller things that they want to do. The one thing that I've heard from people in the Moon administration was they thought what Roh Moo-hyun did wrong 10 years ago was too many big things and not enough small incremental things. And that's why they have the demining and the guard posts in the northern limit line. So there's some real progress that can be made even while you go for the home run. And I think there's still some more things there that they're trying to do. The rail line, they want a third survey. So I think South Korea has a strategy, and you could hear this from the talking points. Moon had two audiences, actually one audience went in the speech here. He's talking to Americans. U.S. ROK. It's it, right? Blah, blah, blah. He clearly wants the Americans on his side. He wants to let Americans know he's not going to sell out the Americans. And so he's got a strategy in place. So I think there'll be some small progress forward. And I think Trump wants the meeting, whether he gets it. It's,
But
that for a non-prediction.
Tom, what's the risk of us falling back to where we were a year ago?
I think this next year will be one of ups and downs. Probably more dramatic ups and downs than we had this year. It was all kind of up from the low base last year, and I do think we're going to have to get back into more regular discussions. I think there's bound to be a lot of acrimony. I think we'll probably see still in this coming year more progress in North-South relations than in U.S.-DPRK relations, and that will bring with it challenges in maintaining our solidarity. We haven't said much. I do think it's significant that Biegun made such a big deal, our envoy made such a big deal of talking about alleviating some of the restrictions on travel and humanitarian assistance. It's a natural thing to do. It's something our humanitarian organizations want. It makes a lot of sense. But he did, kind of offer it up in a special statement as he was going to the ROK. And of course, we were met by this brick in the face by the North Koreans. So I don't know how that goes, but I think our side is looking for ways to keep this going and looking for ways. Began has made quite a big deal of the this new working group we have. He's in Seoul right now as part of that, so I think this is going to be a year of hard work and a lot of ups and downs, and we have a lot going on in the United States that can affect our president's attitudes and the way and our approach to the whole thing.
Right. Okay. Should we open the? I think we're at the time when I can turn to the audience for questions. So please identify yourself and make your questions question-like, so we can have as many questions as possible. Okay. In the back, someone's standing up. The lights. I just see a hand.
So much talk about. Albert Golson, I focus on geopolitical risk. There's a lot of talk, of course, about denuclearization on the Korean Peninsula. Could you expand on an issue that seems to be in the background in terms of cybersecurity issues, please?
Yeah, it's a big issue. I'm not expert enough in the area to really address it in a very technical way. I might say, just by way of anecdote, that it was mentioned that my main job is with McClarty Associates, a strategic consulting firm in Washington, and we have one of our businesses is advising filmmakers on their we help them get locations abroad. We give them some sort of political correctness advice and all of that. And a little over a year ago, Sony Studios called us and asked us for our advice, and they were really worried about potential assassination or something if they went forward with that movie. And I guess my advice was, I don't really expect assassination, but the North Koreans can do a lot of other bad things to you if you go ahead with this. They did it anyway, and we saw the results. So that's maybe a kind of a light moment for the morning, but this is going to be continuing an ongoing problem. And David, maybe you know more about the subject than I do. Yeah.
No, other than it's an issue.
We had a series of 3 roundtables here on the cyber threat from North Korea. And one of the things I learned from that is that when economists look at trade with North Korea, what we see is what's called visible trade, merchandise trade. And it really is visible. It's stuff coming over and into Korea, North Korean stuff going over mainly to China these days, since North Korea no longer has trade relations with South Korea or Japan. So what we learned was that the North Koreans are very adept at hacking. It's Sony found out, but also they this perpetual structural trade deficit, and everyone's scratching his head saying, well, how does North Korea finance this? Well, one way is probably through the rip-offs that they do in cybersecurity. North Korea. We had a cybersecurity expert from Symantec, and he was convinced that they have ripped off the international financial system, mainly through the SWIFT fund transfer system, by the tune of at least $1 billion in 2 years. And that would alone finance 1 year's trade deficit. And then there's a lot of other activities that go on. So whatever's going on in that realm, North Korea is very competent at cyber.
Yeah.
Go, Denise. Hi. Yeah, go ahead.
Great panel.
Could you? I know who you are. Could you identify yourself to the rest of the audience?
Denise Pellegrini, Bloomberg Radio. Great panel. We know that personalities play such a strong role in shaping history. I mean, Gorbachev, Reagan, Moon. You've talked about the current situation in that regard. But what about geopolitics? I mean, this is not happening in a vacuum. And we know that the relationship between the U.S. and China is somewhat tricky. It also seems, if I sort of track how things are going with North Korea, that there seems to be some similarity, some sort of corresponding track between U.S. and China. Things are going well between the U.S. and China. Then North Korea, South Korea relations seem to warm up a little bit. Things ice over between the U.S. and China, and then all of a sudden we start having what seems like, the boys coming out of the alley with the baseball bat again on the nuclear thing. What is the relationship there? What do we need to see in terms of U.S.-China relations, if anything, for things to really progress between North Korea, South Korea, the U.S., and denuclearization?
I'm struck, Denise, that we've managed to sit up here for an hour and talk about North Korea, and nobody has mentioned China. And I think it is a fact that events over this past year have been driven less by China than by these unusual leaders we have in the two Koreas and the United States who are pushing things. Obviously, China's cooperation is essential to effective sanctions, and our cooperation with China has been challenged in a lot of ways over the past year. What I tend to hear from people more expert on China and involved in government is there's been at least implicit agreement that we're going to wall North Korea off from the other issues with China and try to work together on it. That while there's been some linkage on the sanctions and all of that, I don't have the sense that from the government that it's been egregious. That actually they've been cooperating still pretty well on the sanctions. But obviously, as U.S.-China relations worsen in other areas, the challenge of trying to stay together on North Korea is going to be even greater.
Right. If I could just follow up on that, I've gotten into conversations on the state of the alliance and China's position on this. If we could imagine a post-nuclear world on the Korean Peninsula where there is denuclearization, to my knowledge, North Korea hasn't explicitly asked for that the U.S. troops leave South Korea. Who would want the troops off the peninsula more, China or North Korea?
Can let me add something in here, right? Because I totally agree with what Tom said, and in a lot of ways, it seems like China has, the U.S. and China have walled off North Korea. A couple things about North Korea, and I'll get to this one as well. About China and North Korea is number one. I've been hearing for 10 years, 15 years, that China's about to change its stance on North Korea. You read about it all the time. Well, they're really mad, they're really frustrated, they're really going to change. So far, I haven't seen a fundamental shift in Chinese policy, meaning they still fundamentally do not think that denuclearization should be ranked higher than stability. And the only way they're really going to do something and really put the screws on is if they think that North Korea is so out of way. So they're willing to put some sanctions on, but are they really willing to squeeze North Korea? It's not. I haven't seen that yet. But the second thing I would say, and nobody knows what's going on, nobody has any idea, is the amount of confusion we had over whether they were mad or had bad relations or not. And then the minute that Kim's going to have meetings, there's like 3, meetings with the U.S. There's 3 meetings with Beijing right away, and they fly the Chinese plane. There could be no more blatant, example of, well, we're actually still pretty influential. So I think a lot of this stuff is a little too much trying to read the tiny little squiggles in the relationship. And the final point about that is when you talk about sort of the Korean Peninsula, I can see why China doesn't like American troops there. On the other hand, if there's one place in the world where China, I would just assume, thinks that they have basically sort of escalation domino. This is their peninsula would be Korea, right? This is a region where the Chinese have been involved for 1,500 years, and so I don't think they're as worried about what's going to happen to that area as I think we think they are worried about it. I think they think we can handle this
because it will fall back under their influence?
It's right there. They have a million troops. They're it's by far the biggest trading partner, et cetera. I mean, this is just part of their influence is massive, right? So, for the U.S. to actually do anything other, I think would require devoting resources that I think everyone realizes probably not at this point.
Bob Carlin, my guru on North Korea.
Yes.
So.
Microphone.
Yeah.
I forgot what I just said. Big problem in 2001 was the political tidal wave. Mm-hmm. On January 3rd, I think there's another tsunami coming. The Democratic Congress comes in. Everybody has subpoena powers. They hate Donald Trump. What latitude is he going to have to negotiate? Is this going to undercut him? Is he going to have to retreat into Fort Apache? Are the Democrats going to wall off the Korea policy and try to preserve the gains we've had? Or are we going to see this baby collapse because the political pressures in Washington?
You know that.
Bob, you know as well as I do, and anybody else in the room, I think I don't think the Democrats will see it in their interest to open this one up. They've got such fertile fields in the president's behavior, in the Russia thing, in the economy that's maybe about to go down the tubes. Nick Bratt ought to comment on that. But I don't see the Democrats opening that kettle of fish or can of worms. And even, as you recall, Obama didn't really open it either. He kind of put it aside as soon as it didn't prove to be easily solvable. So I kind of don't see this as a huge political issue. There's too much other stuff out there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, right here. Mm-hmm.
I'm Joe, the director of Korean Cultural Center, New York,
mm-hmm.
and I want to touch on more on the soft power side to Professor Kang. Mm. As you well know, Korea is a very homogeneous country in many ways, and consequently, overall sentiment or the national emotion towards reunification is very high. Mm-hmm. Despite decades of conflict between two Koreas. How much do you think the sentiment factor of Korean people is reflected in U.S. policy and Korean issue? Or should these factors be much more better considered for better understanding on the recent South Korean flexible approach to North Korea? Thank you.
How much is American policy take
American
into account?
Policy, yes.
Probably not that much. America tends to take American issues into account, not South Korean ones. But the larger point I'll say about South Korean sentiment is, I think you've seen this over the decades, that South Korean's public sentiment can shift fairly rapidly. So I remember, again, during Kim Dae-jung and Roh Moo-hyun, 70% wanted to engage. Park Geun-hye comes in, Lee Myung-bak comes in, the sort of more conservative presidents come in. There's 70% are for sanctions. Right? I mean, that's just the way sort of South Korean sentiment moves. And now I think there's deep support for what Moon is doing. The one thing I would say about the soft power, the lower thing is that no matter what, though, I think there is a greater willingness in South Korean public sentiment to support engagement than in the U.S., because I think in many ways they have, as you said, they've lived with it more. There's a lot of family ties. There's much more appeal for trying to take actions that would engage the North. Whereas I think in the U.S., I think there's probably, in general, probably more skepticism.
As a follow-on to that, I get the impression that the South Koreans are more willing to engage the North on the soft power side than the North Koreans are willing to engage the South Koreans. One expert told me in South Korea that the family reunions are actually an administrative nightmare, a headache. Let me put it that way: headache for the North Koreans, selecting the people,
Who can be trusted.
presenting them, and all the logistics involved in all of that. And so, there's an asymmetry there. I think that the South Korea is a lot more willing to engage in soft power-wise than North Korea.
Can I make one small comment, which I think I'd like to help us in terms of the I mean, I'm much better on sort of how to think about North Korea than on any policy that we're going to do. I mean, that's what I do. North Korea today is not the North Korea that it was 10 years ago or 20 years ago, right? It is a different country. It's changing, and it's up to us to continue to understand how it's changing. One of the most interesting ways that I didn't ever think I would see is that it is more open now than it was. Not because the government wants it necessarily, but in some ways, there's more people coming in. We have in the Next Gen program that I run with Victor Cha, where we take young scholars and help them get involved, and I see one of the former ones right there. We have a guy who taught, American guy, who taught 3 semesters in a row, 3 years in a row at PUST, Pyongyang University of Science and Technology, computer science. We have people today literally tweeting from inside North Korea, right? So it's not as open as we'd wish it were. It's not anywhere near as open as we wish it were. But just that you can actually have someone who's emailing out and tweeting from North Korea, inside North Korea today, is something I didn't expect to see until the regime just collapsed. So the regime is changing. I mean, the country is changing. People have more access to information now than they used to. That doesn't mean it's going to collapse right away or it has a meaningful impact on policy. But the people's lives is clearly more open than it was.
Right. What's it? 6 million cell phones is the number. 1 out of 4 North Koreans has a cell phone. Here we all have 2 or 3 cell phones, right?
And isn't that one of the reasons it's not going to go all the way back to what it was?
Yeah, I don't think it can.
Particularly in
I don't think you can do
in
that.
the soft realm. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. The woman at the end. Go ahead.
It's Rhonda Haubin, and I've been at the UN for 12 years reporting on what's going on. I wrote originally for Oh My News in the English edition, and they ended it. So now I have a blog at Taz, Die Tageszeitung, but in English. And also I've studied netizens, and I've been really interested in netizens. And this is, I wondered what you see as the candlelight's influence on putting this whole situation in front of us and making this all possible.
You mean the candlelight
so,
protest?
South Korea.
Yeah.
There's been 3 of them, the most recent, etc.
Yeah, I mean, speaking of the candlelights that brought down Park Geun-hye, it seems to me that this would not have happened in the same way if Park Geun-hye was still in office. I don't think the North Korean strategy would have been as successful as it has been, and I have tended to be one American who would like to see South Korea in the lead of all of this process of reaching out to North Korea, bringing it into the world. And I wrote an op-ed, I think in the Hill, just at the time of the candlelight things, saying that maybe one positive thing we could think of in terms of North Korea. I also have long felt that we need to be talking to the North Koreans. We need to be in some kind of dialogue, and it was politically difficult for any American leader to do that. I said one good thing may be that it will bring about a progressive administration in South Korea, which would take a greater lead, move forward, get us all back into more engagement with North Korea. That was before Trump was elected and before Moon Jae-in was elected, but I ventured that prediction, and it did come true. Yeah.
Okay. Mm-hmm.
Giosetta Capriati, Foreign Policy Association. President Moon had promised to invite Kim Jong-un to Seoul on official visit. He hasn't done so yet. Why? And you think he should, and therefore improve the relationship, or he should hold on under the circumstances?
Hasn't it sort of been offered? Am I missing? I'll look to the.
Yeah.
Isn't a offer to Kim Jong Un to visit, like, isn't that on the table, or is that not been official?
No, I think it's very much official and just hasn't occurred
yeah, it just
yet.
hasn't been. It just hasn't been accepted.
You know, I'm not privy to the discussions that have gone on. I think South Koreans are disappointed, including in the government, I assume, and you know, it just hasn't happened. I mean, one of the things I've often thought about and have never had a very good answer to, or you know, very good idea myself, is it better to have Kim Jong-un go to Korea, South Korea, or Seoul before Trump meets again with Kim Jong-un, or is the reverse better? And I don't know how the North Koreans really see that, but certainly this hoped for visit has not occurred yet.
Just to make a small comment on it, right? In some ways, if I were Kim Jong-un, I would be playing it out a lot slower.
Yeah.
I don't think there's any hurry to go and have another summit right away, no matter what. The prospect of two summits, both with Moon and with Trump, are likely to be ways in which, again, we won't be returning to fire and fury as long as these are on the table. So you could have one in the spring, you could have one in the summer, and you could really play it out. The other thing is, if you think about the pace from the North Korean side, it is really easy for us to fall into the idea that it's one dictator, a totalitarian dictator, and 25 million slaves. But everything we know about even totalitarian governments there are intense domestic politics going on, factions and everything else. So for Kim to move so quickly in 1 year, I mean, think of the dizzying speed that all his generals, everyone in the bureaucracy, everyone in the foreign, whatever, right? Everyone has to be able to deal with a president who is doing unprecedented moves towards both South Korea and the U.S. So I think there's, in a lot of ways, this isn't something where you just go bam, 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 bam. I mean, this is really hard. Think about like what Kim probably has right now. There's probably as much skepticism among his advisors as there is in D.C. And he's trying to go slow and say, look, we can actually do this. We can do this. It's going to be okay. So I don't think there's a lot of hurry on the Kim side. He's already moved so much farther than any other North Korean president or leader. So I think I wouldn't be surprised that it's actually slowing down while they try and figure out what this means for their own careers and policies and their own internal situation.
Good. I'm glad we talked about the internal situation. I mean, it's a black box really, but what I hear is that that Kim Jong-un is leading this, and there are reluctant factions within the elite who would see their special interests threatened by engagement, and also with an opening of the economy. Jonathan, there's a person standing right next to you with his hand up. How much more time do we have, Jonathan? 20 minutes, okay.
Hello, Henry Farron from the Center for Korean Legal Studies at Columbia Law School. Thanks a lot for the very qualitatively very high-level discussion we had today. I thought one subject that we didn't address, and which is characteristic of the discussion that's going on right now, is the question of a peace treaty and end to the Korean War. Like in the US, we talk about nukes, 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 and whereas in Korea, the discussion is more centered around peace, peace, peace. Mm-hmm. So I guess one of the differences in the North Korean posture compared to the time of the agreed framework is that back then, when they had very low bargaining power, they would be ready to talk about denuclearization upon the promise that the question of peace would be discussed afterwards. And now they're asking basically for it to be discussed simultaneously or previous to denuclearization. Do you think we're going to see a peace treaty in the sense that denuclearization, as Professor Kang pointed out, is almost impossible because there is unrealistic expectations on both sides? But the question of a peace treaty ultimately doesn't, I mean, the enforcement mechanism for denuclearization is sanctions. It's not necessarily whether there's a state of war or not. So will there be do you see a shift of thinking on peace as something to reduce tensions on the Korean Peninsula in a way to change the relationship between the US and North Korea? Do you see this happening within, let's say, the next 5 years? Thanks.
You know, we talk about peace in a lot of different ways. You know, you talk about a peace treaty. People talk about a peace regime. You know, and people talk about a state of peace. And I hear the North Koreans talking less about a peace treaty than about a state of peace, a state of peace in which they have security guarantees and we no longer threaten them. And you know, in Singapore, this idea of some sort of overriding state of peace, you know, would happen. South Koreans, I think, tend to talk more eventually about a peace treaty than the North Koreans do. I mean, every time we've sat down with the North Koreans, you know, what they want us to do is offer the security guarantees, you know, and you know, how can we guarantee the regime? You know, does that imply we're going to somehow support them internally? You know, we have said in almost every way possible that we have no hostile intent against them. We've done this in a variety of statements through the years, including 25 years ago when we first sat down with them. And, you know, that never is quite enough. So I don't know. I think we have to have a lot more. We've, you know, explored all of these concepts in the 6-party talks and 4-party talks. We're not there yet, and I don't see a peace treaty in 5 years. Maybe David is more optimistic than I am.
Not about that, I'm not. No,
Yeah,
right?
yeah.
Can I say something? Is that
Sure.
Yeah, I mean, I don't know. I haven't really paid a lot of attention to all the various proposals over the years because they're all sort of peace treaty this, blah, 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 right? It never goes anywhere. Because it's true. We have said numerous times we don't have any threatening intention. And then we turn around and say, if you do anything wrong, we're going to wipe you out with our nuclear weapons.
Yeah.
You know, I mean, of course, why do they not? I don't get why they don't believe us. We're so peaceful people. Until there was this great tweet from some congressman after the meeting which said, we welcome Kim Jong-un to join the community of the world unless we have to go in and kill him or something. You know, it's like, and so of course they don't believe it, right? I mean, and so I don't really care about that kind of stuff. I think what's interesting is, like, if you look at Taiwan and China, 25 years ago, they were launching missiles at each other and there was a lot of worry. One of the biggest questions on the Taiwanese side was how much to let relations open up with China. So one of the key things, of course, was like direct flights, because this is really, this is really saying, okay, here we are, we're sort of open, you know, and like 5% of Taiwanese have moved back, like 1 million Taiwanese have moved back to Shanghai to open up. You used to have to go through Hong Kong and all this kind of stuff, right? I mean, there were a bunch of things you can do, and we still don't think Taiwan and China are peaceful, but certainly it's far less dangerous than it was, and there's far more interaction. And I suspect that what South and North Korea are doing would be, I mean, here's one thing you could do, which you could change the day later if you don't like it, which is if you could actually get in a car in Seoul and drive to Pyongyang in 2 hours. That would be tremendous, right? If you could allow that, right? Which doesn't require a peace treaty. Yeah. But imagine the change of mindset if you were to start allowing sort of direct flights between driving between North and South Korea.
Well, they are talking about rail now.
And they're talking about rail. I mean, but if you could do that, that's not even a peace treaty, but it would tremendously change what was going on, right? And I think this whole idea of hosting the Olympics, because imagine what North Korea has to do to actually host the Olympics. We'll see if this ever comes, because that's huge. You're going to have millions of people showing up. No longer can you have one group and a little handler for everybody, right? That's a totally different mindset on the North Korean side. So who knows if they're serious or not. But these are steps well below an actual treaty, but would probably make a massive difference in terms of how we view North Korea and how they view us, the outside world.
Okay, good. Let's go right over here in the front. Go ahead.
Thank you, Tom, and thank you both for being here. Fantastic discussion. My name is Andy Laub. I'm with Young Professionals in Foreign Policy. I wanted to ask you both about the implications for the diplomatic process should Pope Francis make a visit to North Korea, or even just broadly, his involvement, as we saw with Cuba before, too. Thank you.
David, I'll let you start with that.
I was going to say you should.
Yeah.
You know, again, I don't know. You know, I mean, one of the interesting things that about Korea is that the northern part of Korea was the one that was most Christianized, was most religious 100 years ago. In large part, that was sort of political because being Christian was sort of anti-Japanese because they wanted you to be Shinto. But what you don't know is like Billy Graham used to go to North Korea all the time during the 70s and 80s. Kim Il-sung's mother was one of the first Koreans to become a Christian back like the 1910s or the 20s. So there's a lot more religiosity in North Korea than we might sort of expect. And I don't know exactly what would be the impact, but I think this would be another way in which North Korea is being opened up in ways, you know. And the other thing is, like, we may not solve the nuclear issue, and Kim Jong-un will probably survive well into his dotage. Yeah. Right, but you know,
let me write that down, and next year we'll.
Yeah, he doesn't look like a daughter to me.
I know, right? But can the lives of North Korean people be changed a little bit? And I think that's also a realistic goal that we often forget because we're so focused on nukes. And I get why we are. I'm not saying we shouldn't be, but there are things going on today that might change the lives of ordinary North Korean people in ways that might make it better rather than worse. And I think that's worth pursuing.
I'm inclined to agree with David on this, but I had a conversation with a very prominent South Korean Catholic businessman who actually was with President Moon when he met with the Pope in Rome recently. Of course, President Moon and a lot of the recent Korean presidents, including Kim Dae-jung, are basically Catholic. This businessman just was horrified by the thought of the Pope, the leader of the Catholic Church that played such a role in the reform and modernization of South Korean politics would go to the north. It was hard for him to contemplate. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Yes, this gentleman in the second row. Mm-hmm.
Thank you. My name is Jay Albin. I actually edit something called the Amateur Computerist, but I don't think that's important. But my thought or my question is, I think the candlelight and the aftermath have weakened the anti-communism in the South, and the reconciliation move is a step forward in that direction. And I wonder if the U.S. risks an alienation of the South Korean people if it interferes with the reconciliation or the progress that's been having. So the U.S., I think, must be very careful about that, or it may be the anti-U.S. sentiment in the South will be reignited. So, well, I wonder if that's a concern that people understand.
I understand it. No, I went through a period of anti-Americanism in Seoul when I was ambassador that most Americans have forgotten about now, and it was triggered by directly triggered by the death of two young girls under a U.S. military vehicle, but. I think part of that whole mood was a view that that under President George W. Bush, the U.S. had begun interfering in the outreach of the then progressive South Korean governments to North Korea, and I think it is an issue that we have to be very careful of. And as I said earlier, I personally have always been more comfortable with the South in the lead in dealing with the North, and perhaps the U.S. advising caution here and there than I am with the U.S. in the lead, either in taking a hard line or, as we did under Clinton, reaching out to the North Koreans. We do need to stay very, very close to the South on all of this, and those the mood is very fragile, and emotions can change very quickly.
Okay, and Jonathan over. Yeah. Okay. Good.
Shira Lowenberg, I'm with AJC, Asia Pacific Institute. In light of what you just said, but also Dr. Khan, I think your opening remarks, you said you just came from Washington, D.C. The U.S. is a significant player in this. Can you said that in Washington there's a lot of skepticism about the North's intentions. Does our administration have a strategy? Are we just reacting? What's your sense from these meetings, and you're in D.C. regularly? What are our interests?
Do we have a strategy? Next question, please.
Well, don't we have an objective?
We have. I think across left and right, Democrat and Republican, denuclearization is the key priority. Keeping sanctions on is widely agreed to. But again, as we know, President Trump is a wild card. And no one would have predicted that he was going to meet with Kim in Singapore. Everyone thought that would come at the end, but he chose to do it at the beginning. So I think that there is and I think once he agreed to meet, what was really funny is I hadn't been invited to DC for any of these sort of off the record, sort of planning briefings or stuff at State Department or whatever, CIA, in a couple of years. And then the minute that he announced he was going, like I get invited, I was there 4 times in a week, bam, 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 bam. Because everyone's like, okay, well, we have to prepare for how we're going to deal with this. So I think the bureaucracies, they did what they do, which is they prepared for negotiations, they prepared for what you don't do, but they're not the ones who make the decisions. And I think it's interesting to watch the top advisors sort of what they do. And I'm no better at reading those tea leaves than anyone else as to what the real strategy would be.
I just let me just add that my sense from the few chances I've had to listen to authoritative administration sources on this subject is that there is less friction in the U.S. ROK relationship than the media has tended to suggest. The South is a little ahead of us. The North-South is going faster than denuclearization. There are always issues coming up on the edge whenever you take a shovel to a rail tie or something. But my sense is, particularly now, we now have a senior working group on U.S. ROK cooperation and trying to make sure we don't surprise each other in any way. Begin is in Seoul now doing that, and my sense is that we're in better coordination than it might seem from the press.
Okay, good. One more question. Yeah, right behind Jane.
Hi, James Park, member of Korea Society. So all the great work that United States and Cuba is working on, and Obama, and Trump said, oh, we're going to take it back, but there's a lot of negotiation going on. Can you learn from what U.S. Cuba is doing to apply it to South Korea in the region and United States involvement?
Do you want to say something?
U.S. and Cuba?
Yeah, is there a model there for? The one thing I'll point out is I don't think isolation of Cuba changed it very much.
Yeah, that's
I don't think that 40 years or whatever. I don't think it had
kept them poor.
Kept them poor, yeah, but I don't think it changed Cuba's.
Yeah. No, but Cuba has been a lot more open than North Korea. There's been tourism and investment
and again,
from
it didn't
Europe.
It didn't cause
a lot
of
Canadians going.
Right.
They kept the regime tight.
Yeah.
But they, at the same time, they kept themselves isolated because there's only 2 countries that are like bona fide countries. I mean, with a population that would suggest a country that aren't members of the IMF, and that's Cuba and North Korea. In fact, you can make an argument that economic development, the prerequisite, or the signal to look for whether North Korea is serious about economic development is whether they join the IMF, as China did when it reformed a year after, Vietnam about a year after, Russian Federation 6 months after the Soviet Union collapsed. Well, thank you all for the interesting discussion, and thank you, the two experts here, for sharing your knowledge and insights.
Good to see you, Dan.
Right. Yeah, we encourage you to fill out your form so that we can learn what you like and help us improve our programs. And we also would like to encourage you to join the Korea Society. It's a bargain. It's $75 a year, and your membership will help support activities like we had today. So thank you.
It was really nice talking.
Very nice thing.
So to
Yes, well,
throttle
if you get to watch,
We have
I live there. And,
we have staff in the back who will
yeah.
help you out with your memberships. If you're interested, please approach us and ask. We're smiling. We're ready to talk to you. We'd love to have you as members and supporters. Thank you so much for coming today. We're going to start with the first 3 rows going into the kitchen here to start with luncheon, and then proceed thereafter to just control the speed and make sure we don't get clogged up. Thank you so much.